So good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much to the HSE and the EPA and the ESRI for having me here to speak today. My name is Claire Cooper, and I work in the Scientific Advice and Research Directorate of the National Parks and Wildlife Service. Put my hand on my heart as I say it. They do like us to wear the branded uniforms. So if there's anybody watching online, I'm hoping for some brownie points. I'm not a health expert, and I've had a really interesting morning here this morning, and it's great to see the different perspectives from the health side. But I have been part of the team who led on the drafting and the publication of the National Biodiversity Action Plan, our fourth plan, that was published in January of this year. And most recently, I've been very fortunate to work on the government response to the recommendations and the calls to actions of the Citizens' Assembly on biodiversity loss and the Children and Young People's Assembly on biodiversity loss. And it was really interesting to see and very heartening to see the level of engagement that happened there and their ambition, and for us to try and work and kind of reflect that ambition in policy. So today I am going to talk a little bit about the policy context for biodiversity in Ireland and our fourth National Biodiversity Action Plan. So this morning we heard all about it, the biodiversity, the importance of the environment in general, but maybe not so much about biodiversity. And I'm sure you're all aware that biodiversity is the variety of all living things, from plants, animals, microorganisms, and that all of those things work together in ecosystems to provide balance and to sustain life. And this biodiversity, it provides us with ecosystem services, so clean air, water, food. It provides us with pest control and with pollination. It buffers us from extreme weather events. It regulates our climate, and it sequesters carbon for us. So it supports livelihoods like agriculture, forestry, and fisheries. And it provides lots of the cultural and recreational values and the dimensions that were talked about earlier on this morning in relation to health. Biodiversity provides us with a lot of that in relation to our well-being. So our health depends on biodiversity in so many ways. The variety of plants and animals and microorganisms provide us with essential medicines and nutritious foods. So lots of the medicines, the raw ingredients for those are biodiversity dependent, of course. Wetlands, forests, and other ecosystems regulate the climate and protect the supply and the quality of water. Our urban green and blue spaces protect our physical and our mental health, but we are losing biodiversity faster than ever before, and that loss of biodiversity does threaten our health. It increases our risk to disease, including pandemics, and our exposure to air and water pollution and to extreme weather events. It can lead to reduced food diversity, which will give rise to malnutritional and deficiencies, particularly in marginal communities, maybe not so much here in Ireland, but certainly in marginal communities worldwide, and increased susceptibility to malnutrition. So it is very important that the health sector recognise that human health and well-being are influenced by the health of our local plant and animal communities and the integrity of the ecosystems that they form. So what then is the status of our biodiversity nationally? Well, we have over 31,000 documented species here in Ireland and over 100 different habitat types, depending on which classification system that you use. And a suite of those habitats and species have been prioritised for protection under EU directives, the Birds and Habitats directives, and under Irish regulations. And we are required to report on that every 6 years. And our last report went in 2019, so we're due to report on that next year. But unfortunately, the picture doesn't look very good. So at our last reporting period, and I don't have any depressing graphs, and maybe I should have to kind of drive the point home, but 85% of the habitats were in either inadequate or bad status. And the very worrying thing is that 46% of those were suffering ongoing declines, despite the efforts over the last number of years at a national and an EU level to protect those habitats and species. Over half of our native Irish plant species have declined in the last 20 years, and really shockingly, 30% of our semi-natural grasslands have been lost in the last 10 years alone. Over 20% of our breeding and 52% of our key wintering bird species are reported to have short-term declining trends. And so basically at a national level and at a regional level and at a global level, they're all demonstrating negative trends and ongoing declines. But I am an optimist, which is, I'm glad to hear that I have an increased life expectancy after this morning. And the press that has been generated by these negative reports does make a difference. And in 2019, after this report came out, there was the declaration in the Dáil of a biodiversity emergency. And in general, the global community has got an increased ambition and wants to step up action. So how has the world been responding then to this biodiversity crisis? Well, at the global level, we have the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, which is the sister convention to the Climate Change Convention, which, and we've talked, again, as I said, a lot about climate earlier on this morning. But the three objectives of the Convention on Biological Diversity are, number one, the conservation of biodiversity, number two, the sustainable use of its components, and number three, the equitable sharing of the benefits that arise from biodiversity throughout the world. The Convention is underpinned by the Global Biodiversity Framework, which was agreed at COP15 in 2022. And that framework adopts a human rights approach, and it recognises that the health of humans, animals, plants, and the integrity of ecosystems are all interlinked and are all interdependent. And so achieving the goals and targets of this global biodiversity framework is essential to us in protecting our health and safeguarding that for the future. At the EU level then, our EU biodiversity policy and our Irish policy is both influenced by and influences the global biodiversity agenda. So the EU published in 2020 the EU Biodiversity Strategy, and that underscores the importance of nature for our physical and our mental health. That biodiversity strategy, it was adopted during the COVID-19 pandemic, and it was a central element to the EU's recovery plan, and it really recognises the crucial role that biodiversity plays in preventing and building resilience against future zoonosis outbreaks. Under the EU Biodiversity Strategy, the Commission also published this Nature Restoration Regulation or Nature Restoration Law, which you might have heard about. I don't know if people are aware of that, if you've heard about that in the news recently, but the Nature Restoration Regulation, it includes overarching restoration objectives, which are area-based and legally binding for the long-term recovery of nature on the EU's land and sea areas. For specific habitats and species. Now, unfortunately, that hasn't passed the final stage at the European Council. So over the next couple of weeks, we'll see if that will be adopted. But that nature restoration law would require each member state to produce a national restoration plan. And so we have reflected the ambition of the EU Biodiversity Strategy and the requirement for a national restoration plan in our own National Biodiversity Action Plan, regardless of what happens, I guess, at the EU level. So our National Biodiversity Action Plan, it reflects the vision of the global vision for biodiversity, that it is valued, conserved, restored, sustainably used, maintaining ecosystem services, sustaining a healthy planet, and delivering benefits essential for all people. So national biodiversity action plans are the mechanism for us to implement our obligations of the Convention for Biological Diversity. And it is an umbrella policy, so it has both focused restoration actions for biodiversity, but it also calls upon other policies in other sectors and elevates the importance of biodiversity within those policies and those sectors. So this is our most ambitious plan to date. It is the first biodiversity action plan to be on a statutory footing, which means that there is, for the first time ever, a legal requirement for us to have a national biodiversity action plan, and that also there is a duty on public bodies, all public bodies that are listed, to consider biodiversity in their decision making and in their programs of work. So again, that's a new thing that hasn't been there in the past, but it is an obligation for all public bodies to consider biodiversity. So this plan will be reviewed in mid-cycle in 2027 to take into account the new and emerging trends. So the vision is supported by 5 different objectives, and I'll just go through each. So the first objective is to adopt a whole of government, whole of society approach to biodiversity. And this objective really focuses on governance, reporting and resourcing. As I mentioned, it's the first plan to be on a statutory footing, and it brings greater accountability to each public body and to each different public bodies and agencies, that they need to give due consideration to biodiversity and they need to report on that annually. So we will be coming back and looking for updates on how the different sectors have considered biodiversity over their last year. That is a requirement. But there's also within that objective an emphasis on addressing the capacity needs to implement this plan. So it's not good enough that just the NPWS or the EPA will have people who are aware of the impact that the biodiversity crisis can have on our environment. And we need that capacity to be across government. We need to raise awareness, and it's great to do so at events like this. The second objective is to meet our urgent conservation and restoration needs. And this is where the meat of the plan really is, and where we have lots of different actions that are focused on conservation and on restoration, implementing conservation objectives and implementing measures, reducing pressures such as invasive alien species and pollution, etc. We have also actions that relate to marine and water and agriculture and forestry, and they're all elevating their actions for biodiversity. And as I mentioned, we also have got several actions that relate to the development of a national restoration plan. So in 2026, we will be publishing a national restoration plan that will have area-based targets. We're looking at, a lot more specifically than we have done in the past in relation to what needs to be restored, what needs to be addressed, and how we're going to get there. The third objective then is around securing nature's contribution to people, and this is again, I guess, reflecting the global biodiversity framework, that we're recognizing that biodiversity supports well-being, livelihood, enterprise, and employment. And this objective and this action, or the actions beneath it, look at opportunities to enhance biocultural values, to include biodiversity in our fiscal policy making, because that's really important to have the financial resources to implement actions, etc. And we look to support businesses in conducting materiality assessments. Somebody else this morning mentioned green procurement and how important that is. And so a lot of the actions under this objective will relate to supporting businesses in that regard. Objective number 4 is to enhance the evidence base for action, and that will support the enhancement of monitoring programs, the standardization of data, and the prioritization of research also. And finally, objective 5 is to strengthen Ireland's contribution to international biodiversity initiatives. So this goes beyond our borders, and I guess particularly on an all-island basis and a shared island basis, recognizing that things like invasive alien species really need to be addressed on an all-island basis, but then also various different actions to make sure that we are maintaining our ambition at the global level, and also increasing our funding to least developed countries to help them in that regard. So how did we develop this National Biodiversity Action Plan? Well, there was a lot more engagement for this plan than there has been for previous plans. So I think we can safely say that in this plan, the people have spoken, and we've tried to reflect their ambition. So we have a biodiversity working group, which consists of officials from different departments across government, and any department is welcome to join that. And they helped us in drafting the plan. We also have a biodiversity forum, who are an independent body who provide the minister advice on biodiversity related issues, and that would have representation from ENGOs and academia and landowners, etc. And then we held a biodiversity conference. Maybe some of you were there in 2022 in Dublin Castle, and we had over 600 delegates attend that, and the Taoiseach at the time gave the keynote speech, and we had 90 speakers, so it was a big deal over 2 days. And then lastly, we had the report of the Citizens' Assembly on Biodiversity Loss and the Children's Assembly on Biodiversity Loss, and their calls to action and recommendations were considered. And we also had a public consultation, which is the statutory requirement. So there was a really high level of engagement, and it is a much more ambitious plan, which really looks across society to implement it. So in conclusion, I wanted to finish on this infographic, which is from the World Health Organization and the CBD-led State of the Knowledge Review, entitled Connecting Global Priorities, Biodiversity and Human Health. And it provides a really nice, I think, visual representation of the connections between biodiversity and health. So collectively, I think we need to recognise the multiple dimensions of health and well-being which go beyond human health and include the health of ecosystems and nature upon which human health depends. We need to embrace the One Health approach, and I think Caroline will speak to that later on this afternoon, looking to balance and optimise the health of people and animals and ecosystems. We could definitely do more in this regard. We would value liaison with other departments and agencies who are willing to come forward and speak with us. We will be reviewing this plan in 2027, like I mentioned. There's a lot to learn, but the EPA have produced a lot of guidance that we can work off, including some guidance in relation to green infrastructure that has been taken up by a lot of the local authorities in recent times. So that's all. I'll just say thank you for listening.